All right, well, welcome. Today is March 16th, 2023, and excited to have another episode of Neighboring 101, another class session. This is session number 29, actually. We just keep going. We have 724 people enrolled in this class now. As you know, when we have live events, we usually have 25 to 50 people that attend live, and then the videos are made available as unlisted videos on YouTube, so they're only available to people who have registered as part of this class. And while those videos typically get 200 or more views from class participants, I think it depends on the topic, but today is going to be a great topic, and I'm excited to have you here. Just a reminder, Neighboring 101, this is the class where we talk with leaders in the neighboring movement and discover ways that organizations and individuals can use the art and skill of neighboring to improve their community and to improve themselves. Our goal is always to encourage participants to make those local connections in their neighborhood to help make their neighborhood and community clean, safe, and friendly. And we have found that lots of times achieving that in the community begins with you and your own initiative in your own neighborhood. So thank you for showing an interest in that topic and being with us today. And again, a reminder that the class videos are unlisted and on YouTube, and you will get a reminder or a recap email after this that gives you access to all those past classes. If you're fairly new to the class and have not participate in some of the others live, those past videos are all linked on that email, so take advantage of that. So I won't belabor the subject today because we have a really special guest with us today on a really special topic. We have Mr. Rogers' birthday coming up, I believe on March 20th, or the Won't You Be My Neighbor Day, as we have celebrated for a couple of years. And Jennifer may want to drop a link to a website in chat as we're really trying to promote that effort this year with Won't You Be My Neighbor Day and that celebration. And so that means March is sort of our annual Mr. Rogers lecture or Mr. Rogers focus. And today we have Maxwell King with us. Maxwell King is the former editor of the Philadelphia Inquirer, and he was president of the Heinz Endowments. He is the author of the national bestseller, New York Times-bestseller, in fact, Mister Rogers' biography called The Good Neighbor, The Life and Work of Fred Rogers. I have my hardback copy right here. It's a great read. I do have to confess to Mr. King, I have listened to your book on Audible. And then I read a paperback version. I had a friend that wanted to borrow the paperback. I didn't get it back in time, so I went and bought the hard copy too. So I've got all the bases covered, doing my part to keep that on the bestseller list. But it's a great read, and so excited to have him here today. Maxwell King in this book really traces Rogers' both personal, professional, and artistic life, really through the decades, and explains what he learned along the way. His book shows how Mr. Rogers treats children with the utmost respect. It shows him as a television host, a musician, a playwright, a really caring individual, caring pastor. And King really presents Mr. Rogers as that sort of loving and compassionate neighbor that we probably all wish that we had. So, Mr. Maxwell King, thank you for joining us today. I'm so glad you could be here live.
Thank you, David. It's good to be with you.
I know it was a labor of love writing this book for you, and it was the first sort of biography that got to be done on Mr. Rogers, which is really a fascinating story. And I know you were going to share with us a little bit today to kind of kick off.
Sure. Well, excuse me. It's the only full-length biography ever done of Fred Rogers. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. First of all, there have been a lot of videos done about the life and the work of Fred Rogers. And I'm sure you guys have seen a number of those. And then the second reason is that when Fred was alive, he didn't want a biography done. A number of biographers approached him and asked if they could work on a biography of him. And he rejected all of them because, as he put it, it's about the children, it's not about me. And so when I came to the topic, I had retired from my job at the Heinz Endowments, which, by the way, was a funder of Mister Rogers' neighborhood. And that's how I got to know Fred Rogers, because our foundation funded the neighborhood. And when I retired from that, the chancellor of St. Vincent College in Latrobe, Pennsylvania, which is where Fred Rogers left his whole professional legacy, to the Fred Rogers Center on Early Learning and Children's Media. He came to me and asked me if I would take a couple of years and help them get the center up and running. They had a building, but they didn't have money coming in and they didn't have programs. So I did that. And during those 2 years, I went to the chancellor and I went to Joanne Rogers, Fred Rogers' widow, and said, you know, you're asking me to try to raise $4 or $5 million, which I'm happy to do, but we need a biography of Fred Rogers. That's one of the tools we need to get the story out to people. And the chancellor and Joanne explained to me that Fred didn't want a biography, and so that's why one had never been done. And I said, with all due respect, Fred is not with us anymore, and we're trying to advance this center and raise money to keep his terribly important legacy going. So we got to do something here. Finally, Joanne Rogers came around and said, yes, you're right, we need to do that. And she said to me, why don't you write it? She knew I had a history as a journalist. I'd been a newspaper and magazine writer and a newspaper editor. And foolishly, because I had no idea how much work was going to be involved, I said, yes, I would undertake that. And it took me, I don't know, 5 or 6 years of research to get the biography done. But it proved to be a very valuable tool in terms of helping the center advance, helping us raise money. And as you said, David, it ended up being a very popular book, made the New York Times bestseller list twice, not because of my skill or anything I did, but because of Fred, because so many people, it came out in 2018, and still so many people loved Fred, remembered Fred, valued his message. And so the book ended up doing quite well. And I still get a royalty check every year from my agent for it. So that's a good thing. By the way, another thing I should add in my own defense is that when I took on the project, the Rogers Center, which had all of Fred Rogers' archives, committed to giving me the exclusive access to the archives till the book was done. And in return, I committed 50% of all the royalties to support the center. Yeah. So still today, as those royalties come in, half of every check goes to St. Vincent College for the Rogers Center. And I'm happy to say we've got somewhere between $200,000 and $250,000 of support to the Rogers Center through the book.
Wow, that is wonderful. I didn't realize that. And that reminds me also, I should have said at the very beginning to those that are on in this class, Mr. King asked us today to waive the stipend that we were going to give him, and we have made a contribution instead to the PBS station in Springfield, Missouri.
Right.
Felt like that was an appropriate connection and
Yeah.
a way to say thank you for participating today. So very important, and that's a wonderful gesture I had no idea that it took 5 to 6 years on the book.
Well, I started out doing research, and then I had gotten to know David McCullough, who grew up in Pittsburgh. And because I was running the foundation, David McCullough would come into Pittsburgh periodically and want to have lunch or dinner to talk about projects he thought should get funded in Pittsburgh. So I got to know him. And when I started to do the biography, never having written a biography before, or the only book I'd ever done before was a small book of poetry. So I asked David McCullough if I could come get his advice. And he very graciously invited me to come up to his place on Martha's Vineyard and gave me an afternoon of good counsel and advice. But among the things among the pieces of advice that he gave me was, he said, what schedule do you have in mind for doing the book? What are you thinking of? And I said, well, David, I'm thinking I'll do 2 or 3 years of research and then I'll start writing. And he said, no, that's wrong. He said, you've got to start writing right now, right away, because your research will be so much better, so much sharper if you're writing. So he said, just start with something. It doesn't have to be at the beginning of the book, or just pick something that's interesting. While you're researching, also be writing. And he explained that if you're writing the whole time, you form a different relationship with your subject. You form better questions. So my plan to do 2 or 3 years of research turned out to be 5 or 6 years of research and writing combined. And then in the middle of it, I went back to work at another foundation. So that kind of slowed it down further also. But the great benefit I had was my relationship with the Rogers Center at St. Vincent College, because I got all those archives, all of Fred's letters, the scripts that he wrote for the program, the handwritten sheet music where he wrote all of his songs. And the other great benefit I got was that the Rogers Center did 63 oral history interviews right after Fred died. They started interviewing family members, people who worked with Fred at WQED in Pittsburgh, people who grew up with Fred in Latrobe. So I had these 63 wonderful interviews, each one about 2 hours long. And that just, that gave me a level of understanding and detail that was just incomparable. So it was the relationship with the Rogers Center, which, as I said, I started out raising money and starting programs for them, but that relationship proved to be just invaluable to me as an author.
Yes, that's a treasure trove to have access to. Wow, it's hard to put a value on that, even just in terms of time that it would take. And then, David McCullough, or David is no slouch in his own right in terms of writing biographies, right? So, I mean, that's quite a connection to have there to get recommendations from. Great.
He was wonderfully helpful.
That's great. Well, I can understand how the process kind of developed for you, and with all that research and all those interviews, beyond even what could be included in the book, I'm sure you feel like you've lived with Mr. Rogers for a number of years and know him really well. I think one of the things that I didn't know and that jumped out at me from the book was that Fred Rogers really came from a wealthy and generous family. And that wealth gave him a strong level of sort of security and experiences, but it also created some hardships for him. And so can you discuss maybe how those two things impacted his life and character?
Yeah. Well, I think when he was a little boy, the wealth of his family did present something of an issue for him. And as you noted, later in his life, it gave him flexibility to develop his career. And he was very wise in the way he used that flexibility. But when he was a little boy growing up in Latrobe, Pennsylvania, during the Depression, during the 1930s, his family was very wealthy. The family owned several businesses, maybe half a dozen businesses in Latrobe. And they didn't suffer during the Depression. They did fine. But his parents were extraordinarily generous people. And his mother was connected to several church groups in Latrobe. And she would meet with these church groups to find out what families were in trouble in Latrobe, who was without food, who was without clothing. And she used the family resources to help people all the way through the Depression. And his parents were really wonderful to Fred. They were kind and understanding, and they did something that Fred later demonstrated on Mister Rogers' Neighborhood, and that is, as a child, they took him very seriously. They didn't dismiss him. They didn't treat him, the old Victorian notion of childhood was children are to be seen and not heard. You get them out of the way. And Fred's parents treated him with great respect and were very responsive to him, but they were also overly protective. Particularly his mother was very overly protective. You remember some of your participants in the class may remember in 1929, the Lindbergh kidnapping, when Charles Lindbergh's baby boy was kidnapped and killed. And families that were wealthy, like the Rogers in Latrobe, were terrified by the Lindbergh kidnapping, and they were worried that their children might get absconded with in a similar way. And so they were protective. And Nancy Rogers was terribly protective of Fred. And they had when Fred went to kindergarten and elementary school, they had the family limousine with a chauffeur take him to elementary school and then pick him up for lunch and bring him home and take him back and pick him up after school. Well, everybody who's been in elementary school remembers that's about the quickest way to get beaten up, as to have the family chauffeur drop you at school puts a mark on you, puts a target on you. And Fred was bullied, and he was teased a lot when he was a little boy, and it was difficult for him. He had a real struggle as a child. He told a story a couple of times about a day when school was let out early, and the chauffeur wasn't there to pick him up, so he started to walk home, and a group of little boys were following him home, taunting him and shouting at him, "Hey, fat Freddie, we're going to get you." Fred was very chubby as a little boy. "Hey, fat Freddie, we're going to get you." And he started to run, and they started to run. And he got to the house of a friend of his family's and knocked on the door, and the woman let him in. And so he didn't get hurt or beaten up, but he was terrorized. He was scared. And he went home and he told his parents, and his parents said to him, "Oh, Fred, that's too bad. What you have to do is just pretend you don't care, and they'll leave you alone. Pretend you don't care." And Fred went up to his room, and he sat in his room, and he thought to himself, "I do care. I care about everything. I care about my parents. I care about my town. I care about everything. I'm not going to pretend I don't care." And that was sort of the beginning of his adolescence. That was the beginning of his kind of turning a corner and becoming a very different child in Latrobe. He eventually became the editor of the yearbook. He was president of the senior class. He was a National Merit Scholar. But he sort of had this moment in childhood that crystallized for him how much he cared about things, and turned a corner and began to sort of fashion the person he wanted to be, fashion the persona that he wanted to be, which turned out later turned into Mr. Rogers of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood.
Yeah, we invest so much time in keeping our kids from having hardships, I think, as
Right.
parents.
Well,
That's what kind of struck me about that, because the hardships really shaped him.
and Fred had a grandfather named McFeely, and Fred's middle name was McFeely, Fred McFeely Rogers. And his grandfather was wonderful to him because his grandfather encouraged him to take risks and get out and do things and not be cloistered. And he told a story about he was visiting with his mother. He was visiting his grandfather's farm, and there was a stone wall, and he got up on the stone wall and began to walk, balancing like this along the stone wall. And his mother and grandmother ran over and said, "Oh, Freddie, you'll hurt yourself. Get off the wall." And the grandfather jumped in and said, "Leave the kid alone. He has to learn. He has to take chances. Let him do what he needs to do." And Fred remembered that for the rest of his life with real gratitude. But you mentioned something else, David, about the family money that I want to come back to because it's so important. Lots of families that have a lot of money, sometimes the children are somehow diminished by that money. They don't go to work, they don't have ambition, they don't try. And so there's a danger, I think, with families that have a lot of money, at least that I've seen in my experience, of the children just sort of resting on that cushion of money. Fred did not do that. Fred was an extraordinarily hardworking, focused, dedicated professional, but he used the freedom of the money to give himself opportunities to develop. So he went to New York in the 1950s and he worked as an unpaid intern at NBC. That's how he learned the television business. So he used the family money to give him the freedom to do that. He went to Toronto and worked for the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation for a while in the early 60s. Then he came back to Pittsburgh because he still wanted to work for PBS, and he wanted to, or PBS didn't exist then, but work for educational television. And he wanted to develop his vision of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. But he came back from Toronto with 2 children and a wife, excuse me, and no job. And for a year and a half, 2 years, he had no job, and he was just working to try to raise money and develop Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. Well, he was working really hard on developing his vision, but he wasn't getting paid. And I always admired the fact that he was a child of privilege, but he used that privilege for very constructive ends. He used it to advance his vision for truly educational television. And I thought that that really struck me as an important aspect of his character.
Yes, that is a terrific insight, and a great example of that. You mentioned that he was doing some of that work before there was PBS, and really in many ways we can thank Mr. Rogers for PBS, at least for the funding of it in those initial stages. It was really his voice and his efforts that helped make that happen.
Exactly. In 1969, there was a Senate subcommittee on communications hearing in Washington under the direction of Senator John Pastore of Rhode Island. And I'll give you an idea how old I am. When I was a cub reporter at the Providence Journal in Rhode Island, I covered John Pastore 50 years ago. So, but how Fred ended up down there testifying at that subcommittee is really interesting, because there was a group of educational television executives led by a guy named Hartford Gunn, who ran WGBH in Boston, which has long been the leading educational channel in the United States. And they had hired a lobbyist in Washington, and they were trying to get money in the federal budget to start the network, PBS. And they got a call from their lobbyist saying that Senator Pastore had agreed with Richard Nixon to cut the money out for PBS because Nixon was desperate to find funds for the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War was funded offline. It wasn't in the budget. So Nixon had to scramble around finding money here and there. And the lobbyist said, you better get some people down here to this hearing. It's taking place in 2 weeks, and you're going to have to win your money at that hearing. Well, Hartford Gunn was a very smart strategist. And he told all of his other educational television executives, you're not going to Washington. I'm going to take one guy with me to Washington, Fred Rogers. And they said, what, a kiddie TV star to testify before Congress? But what Gunn knew was he needed someone who would come across as completely authentic to the Senate, but also to the television audience that was later going to see tapes of that. And Rogers was just brilliant. You could see, lots of you probably seen the tape of Rogers' testimony in that hearing. And at the end of it, John Pastore says, well, Rogers, looks like you got your $20 million. He didn't even take a vote of the committee. He just gave him the appropriation. But that was one of the results of Fred Rogers' extraordinary authenticity as a person, which comes across in person and on television.
Yeah, it came across that hearing when he tossed his script to the side and didn't even use the prepared remarks, right?
Yes.
So his authenticity.
He knew that Pastore had a reputation as very gruff, short-tempered, and he decided that being very personal was the right way to go. And of course, he was absolutely right about that. That's a piece of tape, it's still every year, millions of people go online to YouTube and get that tape and look at it. It's really worth looking at.
You mentioned personal, and I will have a question that's maybe a little more personal in nature, but I want to remind everybody that's in the class too, as in the past, you are welcome to ask questions. If you'd like to type the question out in chat, I can read it for you. I know several of you have read the book now, so please chime in here with your questions as well. But this is a little more personal in that you invested 5-6 years in research, gained to know Mr. Rogers, writing this book, things. How did writing this book change you? How did getting to know Mr. Rogers change you?
Well, it did change me. I think that, I took it on mainly because Joanne asked me to do it, but also because I had come to believe during the years that I was in Pittsburgh and we were funding the neighborhood. And I only got to know Fred a little bit. I only met him twice. But I came to believe very strongly in his legacy as an educator with children, but also as an exemplar, a person who exemplified the best, strongest human values. And so I really came to believe that it was worth making the effort to try to advance his I see. To advance his legacy. But, I spent the first 30 years of my life as a journalist. So I'm not a model of patience. Everything is about what are we going to get done in the next hour and a half, put out the next day's paper, and then come back in and start all over again. So that was probably the biggest lack in my character was patience. And what I learned more than anything from Fred Rogers was that to do the kinds of things we want to do, to be neighborly, as you were referring to earlier, to be responsive to people, to be kind and thoughtful, all things we want to do and that I very much want to do. It's essential to slow down and be patient. You know, we live in a world that's so fast-paced, and it seems as if every year it's going faster and it's more complex. And what Fred Rogers taught me through all the research I did into his work, but also how his character as a person evolved, was the tremendous value of being patient, of deliberately, intentionally, thoughtfully slowing yourself down. And when I go out and speak about the book, which I do fairly frequently, I was just in Ohio yesterday giving a lecture on the book. Very frequently, people will ask me, can you boil Fred Rogers' message down to a few words? And I always, I acknowledge that it's a disservice to such a deep, complex man to boil it down to a soundbite, but I can. And I started doing that really for myself as sort of a reminder about this matter of patience that I've been talking about. And so what I say to them is, the simplest version of Fred's message that he himself reminded himself of frequently is slow down, be kind. Slow down, be kind. And for Fred, the kind part couldn't come if you were going 100 miles an hour in 16 different directions. He recognized that if you're going to be present for people and responsive to people, you had to slow yourself down. And everybody who ever met Fred reports the same feeling, the feeling of time slowing down when you spent time with Fred.
Well, that is a terrific insight, and he modeled that as well. We've talked on this class before, even about research demonstrating that people who are busy are less likely to make neighbor connections. That's a very frequent excuse for not doing so. And there's lots of things that contribute to that busyness, but we're less likely to make those types of connections. So you do have to intentionally make some choices about slowing down. But that's a terrific insight from Mr. Rogers and how that impacted you. Then thank you for that. Well, I remember, and you've alluded to this in some ways, he seemed to be very detail oriented, precise about a lot of things. And I noted in the book that you detail how his show scripts went through 9 steps of translation for his young audiences. And so although the show seemed simple, it was a painstaking process to get to that point. And that wasn't the only thing he was precise about, but I doubt there's many other shows that have a script for something like that goes through that much translation and work. It was really it was truly educational television. It wasn't just commercial fun television. It was educational.
And he was frustrated in the 1950s when he produced a program called The Children's Corner at WQED in Pittsburgh. It's the first children's program he ever produced. And it was very successful. It got a big local audience. It got a lot of awards. It won the Sylvania Award, which was the big award for children's television back then. NBC considered syndicating it nationally. So it was a very successful program, but Fred was frustrated by it because he saw it as just entertainment, not education. And what he was really interested in, what he got interested in when he was learning television in New York, was the idea that television could be a serious, important educational instrument, particularly for young children. And of course, nobody back in the 1950s saw television that way. They saw television as a entertainment vehicle, as a vehicle for commercials, for advertising products. And Fred was almost unique in seeing it as having this great educational potential. But later, after the Children's Corner wound down, Fred studied early childhood education at the University of Pittsburgh. And he studied under a woman named Dr. Margaret McFarland, who was one of the leaders in early childhood education in the country. And there were all sorts of other great academics at Pitt at that time in the early childhood field. Benjamin Spock, the baby doctor, was there. Erik Erikson, the great American philosopher and student of human development, was there. So some of the most important research into early education was going on at Pitt then, and Fred was dropped right into the middle of it. And it gave him, NBC gave him the tools to make good television. Pitt gave him the understanding of early childhood education to be able to set the highest standards. And Dr. McFarland, by the way, for the whole rest of her life till the late 1980s, advised Fred on all the scripts for Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. And he was terribly precise and demanding because he got this great understanding of how important early childhood education was and how important having the right standards, having the right approaches, having the right style was for young children, and how if you used the wrong word or said the wrong thing, it could have a negative impact on very little children. So he was tremendously precise, and he was very intentional in everything he did. But he was also wonderfully relaxed with his staff. All of his staff loved him and felt as if he gave them lots of opportunities to express their own creativity in their work. So he managed to be demanding of himself and the staff, precise about what was good educational television without being rigid and doctrinaire. It's a real kind of a wonderful eye of the needle to be able to thread as a creator. But I think he did that very successfully.
We're talking, of course, about his legacy, but also his impact on individuals, and but even his impact on communities. I remember a gentleman a couple of years ago who was from Latrobe and was talking about the Mister Rogers effect in Latrobe, is what he called it. He'd heard a story where a new police officer had come to Latrobe. The officer had gone back to the police station. It was a hot day outside, and he asked the chief. He said, "What is the deal with this town? I just made a traffic stop and wrote this lady a speeding ticket, and she handed me a cold bottle of water saying I looked hot, and then thanked me for writing her a ticket." And he says, "Everywhere I go, people around this town thank me for stuff, even when I'm writing them a ticket." And the chief had said, "Oh, that's the Mister Rogers effect on Latrobe." So the kindness of one person, right? The kindness example can really rub off on other people, and even on the whole community.
And I think that really started with Fred's parents. Fred became this powerful exemplar of human kindness, but he learned that from his parents. I've mentioned earlier that his mother was always looking for opportunities to help people in Latrobe. And every year she would go to New York and do Christmas shopping in New York, and she'd come back with somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500 Christmas presents, because she bought a present for every family in Latrobe that she knew. She was just extraordinarily generous in her nature. And Jim Rogers, Fred's father, ran several big businesses, but the biggest one was the Latrobe Machine company, which had, I think, 450 employees. Jim Rogers would put a chew of tobacco in his cheek and go out on the floor of Latrobe machine and walk the floor, and he knew everybody by name. And he would ask them about their family, asked how they were doing. When somebody had some serious problems, he'd come back and tell Nancy Rogers, and she'd do something about it. And when every week at payday, sometimes 2 or 3 or 4 days after payday, some of his employees would come back to Jim Rogers and say, for whatever reason, they went to the tappy and drank too much, or the kids needed something, they were out of money. And Jim Rogers would write them a loan. And he had kept a huge ledger book of all the loans. And when he died, the executors of his estate found the ledger book in the safe. And like 10% of the loans had ever been repaid. The Rogers were very wealthy, and they were in this small city, and they knew that their place in this city was very special. And so they compensated in a way for being so privileged by being extraordinarily generous with everybody in town. And there's still all through Latrobe, their parks, a swimming pool, programs that they funded when they were alive, and that Fred continued to fund when he was alive. And so their exceptional human kindness, which their son later became the exemplar of, really did have a huge impact on the character of that town.
What an example. I can't fund a swimming pool, but I can probably do a little more in helping my immediate neighbors in some ways when needs become known. And that's quite an example they've set there.
Yeah.
To live up to even.
Well, it's always a balance, I think, between how much of your resources do you apply to your own family, and how much can you give to other things. It's a balance that you have to keep looking at every year and making the right judgments about.
Yes. I had a class member text me a question here and just said that she was really surprised to learn that Mr. Rogers wrote all of his own songs. Did you pick up on something maybe about his view of music as it relates to children and their development? Was that also an educational component, or was it just because he was gifted in music?
Well, I think it was mostly that he was gifted in music, but the thing about Fred that's so interesting from a career standpoint is when he was a young man, he wanted to do everything. He would come home from college and see his parents at break. And every time he came home, he had a different idea of what he was going to do. He was going to get a PhD in French and become a French teacher. He was very proficient in language, particularly in French. And then he was going to, his girlfriend, Joanne Bird, who later became his wife, thought he was going to run an orphanage because he cared so much about little children. He was always going to one program or another in Florida, where Rollins College is, where he went to college, to try to see what was happening in terms of education of young children. His father wanted him to come home and run the family businesses. Fred told his parents he was going to be a musician. He was going to be a composer. He was going to be a diplomat. He was going to go in the Foreign Service and become a diplomat. He told his mother he's going to become a Presbyterian minister, which he later did. So he had all these different ideas, and they involved music, puppets, education, television, everything he encountered, he got enthusiastic about. But here's what's amazing about Fred, and it says so much about his character and his serious sense of purpose as an individual. By the time he got to Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, he brought all those things together. So the puppets were there, the music was there, He played the piano, the compositions were there. He wrote all the scripts. He wrote 200 songs. He wrote 13 operas. He wrote 900 scripts. So all these different interests he had in language and music and children and television and educational programming, he did them all.
Yeah.
He pulled them all together into a coherent, focused career that made a big difference in the lives of millions of people. That's one hell of a record.
It is. That is one great example of discipline too.
Yes. Well, discipline, yeah, discipline and focus. I mean, he was the most intentional person in the world in terms of how he lived his life. But at the same time, he would stop everything to talk to other people. He wasn't rigid. He was disciplined. He was really focused and hardworking, but he was never rigid. He was always home in the evening to be with his children. He was always responsive to people whenever he would encounter them. I mean, Bill Eisler, who ran his production company for years, would tell a story about they were in New York filming an episode of Mister Rogers' Neighborhood. They had a union crew on the clock, costing them money, waiting for them. And they're walking down Fifth Avenue. And there's a homeless person sitting with his back to the wall. And Fred stops to put a $5 bill in his cup. And the man said something to Fred. In an instant, Fred is sitting down on the sidewalk with his back to the wall, talking to them. And the man didn't know who Fred was. It's just somebody to talk to. And Fred spent half an hour talking to the man while Bill Eisler desperately tried to get him going so that they could film the episode. But that's one of the great charms, I think, of Fred Rogers. Focused and intentional, but at the same time, he assigned himself such a high priority to being responsive to people that he would stop anything and respond to people.
Yeah, a lover of people.
Yes.
Well, our time is winding down, so just two more questions here as we wrap up. We have one from class member Michelle, and she says, why do you think Mr. Rogers still resonates with people today when society has become so much more cynical?
I love that question. I think there's lots of reasons, but I think there are three main reasons. Number one, education. He taught America the importance of early childhood education. All these researchers at Pitt back in the 50s were learning about it, but they were writing papers for each other. They weren't telling the public about it. Fred Rogers and Joan Gans Cooney, who started Sesame Street, educated scores of millions of Americans about how critical education is in those first few years. So that's one of the reasons I think that his legacy is so enduring. The second reason is Fred as an exemplar of the human values that we cherish, that we try to live our lives by, and that right now in today's world, we're worried about, we're scared about what's going to happen to those values. And Fred, starting with his Christianity, but all his life, he was a student of other philosophies, other religions, and he sort of became this exemplar of universal human values. And so I think that's a big part of why we turn to Fred today, still on the internet, on social media, on YouTube. And then finally, this thing about human kindness. The way he lived his life and the way he taught children was such a wonderful, powerful example of human kindness in action. And I think we gravitate toward that. As we cope with a fast-paced, complex world, we gravitate to that. So here we are, 20 years after Fred died, 25 years after he stopped producing children's television, and he's still everywhere. He's in movies, he's in books, he's on the internet, he's on social media, because I think we care about those things that Fred cared about.
Yeah. It sounds like you weren't surprised to find that out, but that was certainly impactful. Maybe maybe surprised to know the depth of it, perhaps.
Yes, and while I was researching and writing the book, that kind of interest in Fred was growing the whole time. Of course, I was the beneficiary of that when my book hit the market, but it was a wonderful thing, a very encouraging thing to watch happen in terms of our culture, our society.
I noticed that one of our participants, Kate, mentions Lou. I don't know if I can pronounce his last name correctly. Ferrigno, the man who played Incredible Hulk.
Oh, Lou Ferrigno, yeah.
Ferrigno.
Yeah.
And that he was at a Comic Con recently, I think that Kate was at, and he remembered meeting Mr. Rogers and back then doing an episode on anger. So
yeah,
I remember you detailing that in the book. That was really interesting how he pulled those things together.
Yeah.
And what
I did a wonderful job of pulling people from popular culture onto the show, including Lou Ferrigno, to help teach children.
Yeah. Well, one final question, and again, I love the book, and I think everybody's been reading about this for quite a while, seen it being plugged, The Good Neighbor. And if you've not taken the time to read it, to listen to it on Audible, do. It's really a great read about a fascinating person, and with lots of timely lessons for us right now where we're living, where we're at. And I was interested in the fact that it doesn't appear to me, when I looked online and in a couple of databases of where you can hire people for events, I wasn't able to find any Mr. Rogers impersonators.
Huh.
There are hundreds of Abraham Lincoln impersonators. There's even a society for them.
Yeah.
There are hundreds of Mark Twain impersonators, which is which is a Missouri thing.
Yeah.
There's almost 50 men that you can hire to be a Harry S. Truman impersonator, which is also another Missouri connection. And then don't even get me started on the number of impersonators of Santa, because we know the real guy's at the North Pole, but there's impersonators everywhere. But gig salad is one of those tools, other tools. I was not able to find anyone that's a Mr. Rogers impersonator. I wondered if you had thoughts on why that might be the case.
Well, he was such a completely distinctive and unusual character. And it's not hard to satirize him, because he had a slightly effeminate manner, and it's easy to, Eddie Murphy did a brilliant job of satirizing him. So it's not that hard to satirize him, but I think to do a convincing job of emulating him is really hard, because he's such a completely distinctive character, unlike almost anybody I can think of. And of course, lots of people today say, where's the Fred Rogers of today? We need somebody teaching children today. And there isn't anybody I can think of who's just like that. Tom Hanks, of course, did a fine job of playing Fred Rogers in the movie. It's a Beautiful Day, I think it's called.
Yes.
And Hanks did a great job because, well, Hanks always does a great job, but he did a great job in part because he was so understated, and he didn't do a caricature. It was a very understated portrayal. But Fred's hard to capture, and he's important. I wish we could find a way to cook up a few more Fred Rogers for today's world.
Yes, absolutely. That's a great observation. We do need some of that in popular culture and kids' TV again. Well, it's a fascinating book on a fascinating subject, and a man that we would all want as our neighbor. And as he often said, the key to success, there are 3 keys to success, right? Be kind, be kind, be kind.
Exactly.
And we could use a lot more kindness in this world.
Yes. Thank you, David.
Well, thank you. And thank you for your kindness in participating over Zoom with us today. And we so appreciate Maxwell King, author of The Good Neighbor. Thank you again for joining us.
It's great to be with you. Thanks, David. Thank you to everybody.
We will.